Imagine standing before the gates of York in the year 866. Behind you, thousands of Viking warriors. Before you, one of the strongest fortified walls in England. And the man who brought this army here cannot even hold a sword. At least, that's what the stories say. But that man knew exactly how those gates would open. He knew where the defenders had gathered, which gate was weakest, what hour the assault should begin. Before the city fell, certain people inside had already sent him word. That man was Ivar, and York fell that day. Ivar the Boneless was one of the most debated Viking figures of the 9th century. His name appears in both the Scandinavian sagas and the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. But each source draws a different portrait. The sagas describe him as a military genius, yet the Anglo-Saxon texts present him as a machine of destruction. Which is true? Probably both, and that is precisely what set him apart from every other Viking leader. You need to understand the geography first, because Ivar's story unfolds across a specific landscape, in a specific era, and without grasping that context, understanding Ivar is impossible. In the middle of the 9th century, England was not a unified kingdom. Northumbria stretched across the north. Mercia sat in the middle, Wessex in the south, and East Anglia along the east. These four kingdoms sometimes formed alliances with one another, sometimes attacked one another, but never managed to organize a truly unified defense. That fragmentation was an extraordinary opportunity for anyone looking in from the outside. And Ivar was exactly that kind of strategist. When the force that would enter history as the Great Heathen Army landed in eastern England in 865, this was no ordinary raid. It was an organized conquest. The plan was to winter long enough to stay, to turn local kingdoms against one another, to seize control of trade routes, and ultimately to establish a permanent presence. The mind behind that plan, in the view of most historians, was primarily Ivar's. But who was Ivar really? The answer to that question is as mysterious as his name. What the epithet boneless actually means is still debated among historians. The most common interpretation is that Ivar may have been born with a condition such as osteogenesis imperfecta. In that case, his bones would have been extremely fragile, making it impossible to walk in any normal way. Some sagas describe him as a man carried on a shield across the battlefield. But that interpretation raises another question. How does a man with physical limitations become one of the most feared military leaders of his age? The answer is simple. War is not always won by holding a sword. Ivar's genius lived not in his body, but in his mind. He knew where to strike the enemy, and he knew when. That was an exceptionally rare skill in the 9th century. Let us return to the fall of York, because that event offers a perfect window into how Ivar thought. In the autumn of 865, the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. They wintered there, acquired horses, and reached some kind of arrangement with the local king. This was not ordinary winter quartering. It was preparation for the next move. As in the early months of 866, the forces turned north. The target was Northumbria, but Northumbria was already consumed by its own internal conflict. A king named Osbert had lost his throne to a rival called Ella, and the two sides were at war with each other. Two Anglo-Saxon power centers were focused not on any outside threat, but on one another. Ivar seized exactly that opening. When they reached York, the city's walls were strong. But its defense was badly organized. The two rival factions inside had not yet agreed on who would actually defend the place. The Viking forces entered the city. The two Anglo-Saxon kings set aside their rivalry, reunited, and attempted to retake York. But it was already too late. In the counter-assault of 867, both kings were killed. Northumbria had effectively collapsed in a single campaign. But Ivar's true genius lay in what he did after York. What did most Viking leaders do after taking a city? They plundered, burned, and withdrew. Or they established a permanent military foothold and remained in constant conflict with the enemy. Ivar did something entirely different. He did not fully annex Northumbria. He did not dismantle local governance. Instead, he established a buffer kingdom under his own control. He installed an Anglo-Saxon puppet ruler and chose to keep Northumbria functional as a resource basin, a buffer zone, and a base of operations. This was not the product of brute force. It was the product of political intelligence. Direct rule requires a permanent occupation force. A permanent occupation force means permanent resource consumption. Ivar instead took over an existing system and chose to make that system work for his own benefit. That meant far fewer men, far fewer losses, and a far more sustainable form of control. That level of administrative thinking, in the middle of the 9th century, was extraordinary. But the event that carved Ivar's name most permanently into history was not the fall of Northumbria. It was the death of King Ella. According to the sagas, Ivar subjected Ella to the blood eagle. This was an execution method both agonizing and deeply symbolic. The victim's back was opened, the ribcage broken outward, and the lungs drawn out. The death carried an overwhelming message, both physical and symbolic. Whether this was actually carried out remains contested among historians. Some regard it as a dramatic addition by later saga writers, as others argue that such a practice was entirely possible given the conditions of the period. But the debate may be focusing on the wrong question. What matters is why this story was told at all, and what it says about Ivar. In the saga tradition, the blood eagle represented the ultimate insult a warrior could deliver to his greatest enemy. This was the vengeance for his father Ragnar Lothbrok. This was a reckoning. And the fact that this reckoning was told in such detail, with such drama, reveals how Ivar was perceived in his own time. He was not simply a conqueror. He was a collector of debts. The second great quality that separated Ivar from other Viking leaders was his ability to build and manage alliances. The great heathen army was not the force of a single tribe or a single leader. Thus, it had been assembled from warriors who came from different regions, different families, different motivations. Holding that kind of structure together requires more than military success. It requires distributing scarce resources fairly, managing conflicts between different leaders, and balancing short-term gains against long-term objectives. Ivar's brothers Halfdan and Ube were also significant figures within the army. But looking at the picture conveyed by the chronicles and the sagas, Ivar consistently occupied the center of strategic decision-making. This model of leadership was different from the charismatic warrior who charges out front and pulls others in his wake. Ivar's leadership was built on coordination, information, and timing. To frame it as a contrast, leaders like Harald Hardrada led by example, just going forward so others would follow. Ivar led by telling people where to go, standing not in front of them but behind them. The second model is far less spectacular, but it is far more effective. After 866, Ivar's movements become partially obscured in the historical record. But the trail can be followed. The Irish annals record that in 870 Dumbarton Rock, the fortress known in its time as Dunbriatan and located in what is now Scotland, fell to a large Viking force after a prolonged siege. Among the leaders of that force appear the names Amlaib and Imhar. Most historians believe these names are the Irish annals' equivalents of Olaf the White and Ivar the Boneless. Dumbarton was one of the most strategically significant points between northern England and Ireland. When it fell, thousands of captives were taken to Dublin. Thus, the same pattern repeated itself here. A strong defense, a prolonged siege, and ultimately an enemy forced to submit by scarcity of resources. Not direct assault, but patience and pressure. Ivar's name inspired fear in Ireland too. The Irish annals describe him as King of the Norsemen. That title derived not from raw military power alone, but from the political network he had built across multiple geographies: Dublin, York, and a portion of Northumbria. Building a network that connected those three was a remarkable organizational achievement for the 9th century. Now let us step back and ask, what truly made Ivar boneless? We cannot know with certainty whether he had any physical limitation. But the paradox that epithet creates tells us something on its own. A Viking's greatest honor was physical dominance on the battlefield. The scars on your neck, the muscle in your arm, the ability to knock a rival down in a single stroke. These were the measures of a man's worth in early medieval Scandinavian culture. Ivar could not play that game. Either he truly had a physical impediment, Or at minimum, he could not perform the kind of heroic display that other warriors staged on the battlefield. And yet he became a leader. Not just any leader, but the most feared one. This represents a cultural fracture. A society holds physical strength as its highest value. But that same society's most dangerous leader turns out to be someone without physical strength. Someone who substitutes intelligence and strategic thinking in its place. And that society continues to speak of him with both fear and respect for centuries. This fracture shows that Ivar was not only a military leader, but a figure who pushed against the limits of his own culture. But honesty requires something here. Ivar's genius did nothing good for his victims. Wherever the great heathen army passed, monasteries burned, villages were destroyed, people were enslaved. The fall of York was not simply a political change of hands. It was the beginning of decades of regional instability. East Anglia's last Anglo-Saxon king, Edmund, was captured and killed in 869. In the aftermath of the Dumbarton siege described in the Irish annals, thousands were sold as slaves in the markets of Dublin. No matter how brilliant the strategy, this was the trail it left behind. To look away from this reality would be to rewrite history in order to make Ivar a hero. Yet he carried every quality of a ruthless conqueror. He was simply more intelligent than other ruthless conquerors. And that distinction holds both his greatness and his horror at the same time. When did Ivar die? That too is contested. The Irish annals record that in 873, Imhar, king of the Norsemen, died. If this was indeed Ivar, he died in middle age, most likely in his bed. That detail matters, both symbolically and historically. One of the most dangerous men of his era did not die on a battlefield. He died of natural causes. That is the inevitable consequence of his capacity to survive, of his tactical mastery. A leader who relies not on physical strength but on intelligence does not put his body at risk. He makes himself irreplaceable. And for that reason, he lives longer. What happened after Ivar? The great heathen army dispersed. Halfdan moved south and eventually returned to Northumbria, opening it permanently to Scandinavian settlers. The region that came to be known as the Danelaw was born this way. This was the era in which the north and east of England fell under Scandinavian legal and cultural influence, a period that would last for decades. The network Ivar had built continued to function after his death. Viking dominance in Dublin lasted until the 11th century. York remained for a long time the most important center of Viking culture in England. That durability is not simply a personal achievement. It is the mark of an institutional legacy. The structures Ivar created left solid ground on which those who came after him could build. In the end, the question must be asked, why does Ivar matter? The simple answer is this: because he demonstrated that power and intelligence are not alternatives to each other. The fuller answer is this: Ivar's story shows us how an era changes. The Viking Age is usually presented in popular culture as a symbol of brute force, of savagery, of disorder. But the most effective leader of that age was not someone who used brute force. He was someone who used knowledge, timing, political intelligence, and the skill to build alliances. That shows us how history actually works. Eras are shaped not usually by the strongest, but by the most intelligent. And sometimes the most intelligent turns out to be someone who cannot even hold a sword. The next time you read something about the great heathen army, look carefully. The account will almost certainly focus on battle scenes, on epic confrontations, as on bloody victories. But behind that account, before every move, months before every city fell, someone was running the calculations. The man running those calculations was the man who was carried. Boneless Ivar. If you want more of these stories, subscribe. Every week, I cover periods of history that have been deliberately pushed to the margins.